Just recently we've discussed the 7 churches and basically the situation and their location in Turkey, from Istanbul and right through the coastal areas where the churches were listed. We've done extensive videos on each of those church areas, and now we'll discuss the impact of those 7 church systems over time. And we'll discuss this paper which deals with the thing called the Pillars of Philadelphia, number 283, which deals with the 7 churches and the implication of each of those churches and what happened to them. Now, in Revelation chapter 1, God gives a prophecy and revelation to Jesus Christ. Now that revelation to Christ was then handed to John on Patmos, and he recorded the book of Revelation. It's called the Apocalypse in the Trinitarian systems because apocalypse means revelation. Now, in that system, the 7 churches were given angels over those 7 churches. And there was an angel over the first church, which was at Ephesus, then Smyrna, then Pergamos, then Thyatira, then Sardis, then Philadelphia, then Laodicea. But the sequence was not to 7 extant churches which would then die out. They didn't, and it wasn't to deal with that. It was 7 angels of 7 churches over a 2,000-year period until the return of the Messiah. And the Messiah is mentioned in each of the prophecies to each of the 7 churches and to the period of the end when he will come and fulfill prophecy and take over the world. And the book of Revelation in chapter 20 shows that he will come and take over the world and rule the world for 1,000 years as the millennial Sabbath of the rule of God under the reign of Christ. Now, this is very important work, very important prophecy, and it's not understood or dealt with correctly by the Trinitarian churches because they're dependent upon hanging on to power for as long as they can, and indeed the last thing they want is the Messiah coming here and ending their system, which is what their own prophecies say. And we've covered that in the last Pope, number 288, dealing with the prophecies of the Malachi Amorgea, which he issued in 1139, and he was the Archbishop of Armagh in Ireland, and that prophecy deals with all of the popes right through until the last pope, and that last pope is replaced by the Christ, who then judges the people. That is, he rules the people, as Revelation says in chapter 20, for 1,000 years. Now, all of those things are important. These 7 angels of the 7 churches were given responsibility, and all of those 7 churches are in fact consecutive eras, and some are operating alongside others, and they each are given a lampstand, and they rule with that lampstand for the period that they are given the lampstand with which to rule by the angels, who are themselves stars. And the stars are generally morning stars, rulers of systems and teachers, as Satan was the morning star of this planet, and Christ will be the morning star that replaces him at his return in the next few years. The messages were given to the angels, and this through, you see in chapter 1 verses 9 to 20, that it's these sequence of churches are given the messages, and there are three significant aspects, and these messages have a number of things from which we, or conclusions from which we draw from these aspects. The seven churches have a lamp of their own. The seven angels are stars in their own right, and the message is given to each one of them separately. In the system, we saw that at the end of the 69 weeks of years, of the 70 weeks of years of Daniel chapter 9, we saw that the second anointed one was cut off, but not for himself, and that was in the year 63 of the current era. That was James, the brother of Christ, and the church, based on the understanding of the texts of Daniel chapter 9, which hadn't been forged as they were in the King James Version. They knew that this second anointed one was cut off, but not for himself, and they knew that in 7 years' time the temple would be destroyed and there would be a great catastrophe in Jerusalem. That was to occur in 70 CE, when the Romans under Titus surrounded Jerusalem, and they then destroyed the city, destroyed the temple, took the artifacts of the temple to Rome, and then left the citizens in dispersion. And in 135, Hadrian then dispersed them completely out of the promised land. We saw with these churches that the church fled to Pella from Jerusalem and then came back to Jerusalem and remained there for some time. At Christ's death, he had placed Miriam, his mother, into the hands of John, and John took her when he left to go to Ephesus, with him to Ephesus, and she lived there and died and was buried there and as was John, in Ephesus, and she is still buried there, and she remains buried and waiting the resurrection at the arrival of the Messiah in the next few years. Now, this is an important phase in the development of the church. Ephesus was the first love of the church, and it's referred to in that vein through Revelation. Ephesus went to significant levels under the Apostle John, and Peter was at Antioch, ruling from there and also from Babylon, and he appointed the successive bishops at Antioch, and the central system of the Middle East was run from those areas, with the various churches organized and located as we have dealt with in paper number 122D, which deals with the establishment of the church under the 70, which when they were ordained from Luke 10:1 and 17. they were sent out 2 by 2, they came back, and then once after the death of Christ, they were sent to their various locations. He had given them instructions before his execution as to what they were to do. Linus, for instance, was to go to Rome. Aristobulus was to go on to Britain and occupy the lands that Linus's uncle had given the church to both Linus and his grandfather-in-law, Joseph of Arimathea, who was the father of Anna and the grandfather of Bran the Blessed's daughter, whom Arviragus married. And Arviragus gave 12 hides of land to establish the church at Glastonbury in Britain, and that was done before the year 40 of the current era, after the death of Christ. All of this is important material. It's covered in the papers, and 122D covers the location of the churches from that time. And that was established all through the Ephesian era of the church. The leaders of the Smyrna era were all educated at Ephesus by John and the people who knew the Christ, the elders of the church and the elderly people who knew the Christ and had moved to Ephesus with the church. And they then educated the people of Smyrna, that is, the people that were to establish the Smyrna era of the church under Polycarp and Polycrates and Irenaeus of Lyon. Irenaeus was a child who sat at the feet of John, and he knew John and all of the elders that knew the Christ alive at the time he was a child. And he then knew Polycarp, and he was trained by Polycarp, and he was sent to Lyon as the bishop in Gaul. And he ran the bishopric in Gaul while the church in Britain was run out of Glastonbury, and was run there by the Unitarian, Sabbatarian, Quartodeciman Christians in Britain for the following 600 years. All of this is extremely important in understanding what's happening in the system. There were no Trinitarians in Britain until the year 590 of the current era. The Celtic Church was not Trinitarian, it was Sabbatarian, Quartodeciman, Unitarian. All of those people had the same doctrines, and they kept the doctrines in which they were trained and organised and supervised from Smyrna. We will see those Smyrna sequences following Ephesus and before Pergamus. I'm afraid Smyrna is only a smaller fraction of the photography we have available from the trips that we prepared, but that's enough to give you an indication of what's happening. It was during the Smyrna era, from 192, that Polycarp had failed in 154 to dissuade Bishop Anicetus of Rome from introducing the Easter system of the god Attis in Rome. And in 192, Victor enforced the Quartodeciman system out of Rome, enforced Easter as a requirement for communion with Rome, which caused the Quartodeciman schism in the church from 192. And that caused the Quartodeciman disputes, and that went on to the Unitarian-Trinitarian wars. Those are also covered in the papers, in the texts, through 277, and also the Unitarian-Trinitarian wars, which is an important understanding of the development of the church through the early centuries. Now, the Pergamus era is not far from Smyrna and Ephesus in the Middle East, and the scenario there is quite dramatic in the films or videos we've taken, and you'll get quite an interesting background to that. But the Pergamus era emerged, and the Paulicians emerged out of the conflicts that came from the Byzantine Empire when it emerged, and the Paulicians formed to the east of the Byzantine Empire right up into the Taurus Mountains, and they formed and stayed there up through until the 19th century. And at the beginning of the 20th century, many of them were martyred. They were slaughtered by the Turks, and also they were not aided by the Trinitarian system from the Greeks either. So these sequences are very important to consider. In the Pergamus era also, we saw the Muslim invasion of Spain, and then we saw the development of the Inquisitions by the Trinitarian system, which was formed from 590 under the Gregory the Great, and that went through for 1260 years through to 1850, and the plebiscite, where the people in the Papal States voted to go into the Italian Republic because they'd had enough of the Trinitarian persecutions and executions. In the Papal States, there was a gallows on every street corner by 1850. From 1823 to 1846, the last persecution of the Trinitarian Church, the Roman Catholic Church, occurred, and they murdered who knows how many people. They executed untold numbers and sent them to the galleys and the prisons, and the people were terrified. Now that was the end and the last Inquisition that went through into the Thyatiran era. Now the Thyatiran era was run from Europe. It was through the Waldensians, and the structure and history is in these works. The paper number 170 holds the edict of the faith of the inquisitors, the Andres de Palacio, the Inquisitor de Valencia. His edict is in there, and there's an appendix to paper number 170, and it's been translated by Professor C. Roth, and we have incorporated that translation in English so that you understand just how serious it all was. Thyatira really copped the burden of the persecutions right through to Transylvania, and the Sabbatarians in Transylvania took a thumping over these Trinitarian structures from both the Trinitarian Catholics, Roman Catholics, and the Eastern Orthodox. And they did that right through until the 20th century. And the Roman Catholic Church with the Lutherans introduced the Inquisitions in the Holocaust from 1941 to 1945 for 1,260 days, and they murdered millions. Over 12 million people were put to death in those 3.5 years. They started the concentration camps, and the Lutheran Church took over the first concentration camp from Hamburg in 1933. It was that early, that serious, and that rotten. After the war, the Roman Catholic Church funneled these Nazi war criminals out of Europe on what was called the rat line, and they sent them to South America, Australia and South Africa. And they got rid of the war criminals out, and we had to hide them, and they should have been executed. Anyway, all of this is now coming to an end. The Sardis and Laodicean churches emerged from Britain and Europe out of the Reformation and the problems that occurred with the decimation of the Thyatiran system. And they were the weakest. The Sardis system was corrupted by the Trinitarians, and they introduced binitarianism to them, and they were unclear in their doctrines, and the Sabbath was not emphasized enough, and they became ambivalent in their doctrines and weak, and ultimately they were to be declared dead. They established themselves from North America in both Sardis and Laodicea. Those systems in North America failed. Sardis is declared dead, and Laodicea was spewed from the mouth of God. And we've explained how and why those things happened, and what is to happen to the people of those churches. Now, the angels were given responsibility for these people. The people in Sardis and Laodicea who were genuine in their works and their faith in the early days will be able to be selected to go into the first resurrection. The people in the later years of the Sardis and Laodicean systems will fail. Now, the sequence of the churches was in the way it was in chapter 1 because it was a mail route. The mail went through Ephesus, through Smyrna, Pergamos, then Thyatira, Sardis, and everyone assumes that it went to Philadelphia and Laodicea because that's the order in which it's listed. But Philadelphia was a separate route from Sardis, so that Sardis serviced Philadelphia and Laodicea from Sardis. That led to a lot of people assuming that the Philadelphian church was before Laodicea, which it was not. And that sequence, the Philadelphian church, is there at the return of the Messiah, as is Thyatira, Sardis, and Laodicea. There is no burden placed on Thyatira in these last days. They did their share of work and carried the burden for centuries. So they are still there, but no further burden is placed upon them. The burden of the faith is put on Philadelphia because it's the only church keeping the faith in worshipping the one true God. Sardis and Laodicea have been corrupted entirely. Sardis now keeps the Hillel calendar, it doesn't keep the temple calendar, and it is binitarian ditheist. Laodicea is either Trinitarian, keeping the Sabbath, or Unitarian, keeping nothing. All of them are declared dead and spewed out of the mouth of God. And they have been declared dead or spewed from the mouth of God before 1994. And that sequence has left them now in a position where the witnesses will now deal with them as we develop the arguments. You'll go on seeing, as we break up the videos, we will put supplementary endings to the 7 churches as we deal with the subjects. And you will see the videos and then be given an opportunity to see the summaries of each of the 7 churches as we progress.